Disc Golf Doctor. Today we're going to talk about stretching, something that so few of us do enough of, and we really need to be doing it to help prevent injuries and to improve function when we're going to play. I wanted to answer a couple of questions that come up when you read current research on stretching, and definitely in relation to what kind of stretching you do in what circumstances. There was an article that Hannah Macbeth put out recently. I thought she did a really good job. I just wanted to talk about a couple of extra ideas that she didn't go into as much detail, but it's not contradicting anything she says, and it's just complementing what she's already done. I'm going to put a link up here for anyone who wants to take a look at that. One of the big questions that the research asks is what kind of stretching you do and when, like we just said. Oftentimes it's recommended do dynamic stretching before a competition. The reason for that is there was a study that came out not too long ago that found when you did a longer duration static stretch, that's holding a certain position, you had decreased peak torque output from that muscle. And you had decreased force production from that muscle, which obviously you don't want right before competition. So that became the recommendation: is stay away from static stretches, do a dynamic stretch. And what's a dynamic stretch? A dynamic stretch is moving a muscle through its range of motion in a controlled manner. Static stretch is just the opposite, it's just holding a certain position. So I can do a dynamic stretch, just bringing the muscle through the length of its flexibility, its range of motion. Ultimately, that recommendation holds today. Focus on the dynamic stretching before an event and work on static stretching in situations outside of that. See lots of people with inflexibility in certain muscles, and that not necessarily directly leading to an acute injury, but building up over time and turning into these issues that develop over time. So figure out, are there certain muscles that are always tight, and stretch them a few times a day so that you have that flexibility, and then when you do the dynamic stretch, it just adds to that inherent mobility you have by warming up the muscle. In the end, that's what it comes down to. So the question is, what is a static stretch? What is a dynamic stretch? A static stretch is simply holding a position for a period of time. Right? One simple example, calf stretch. If I hold this position for any length of time, that's a static stretch. A dynamic stretch is just the opposite. You have movement. Right? You're moving through a range of motion. If I want to stretch out my pec muscle dynamically, I'm going to do this. I'm bringing it from a shortened position to a lengthened position in a controlled manner. All right? The whole idea is I'm just getting that muscle moving. It's causing an increase in tissue temperature and therefore pliability. So what are some good examples of exercises to do before a competition? Dynamic stretches. So you really want to stretch any muscle you're going to be using significantly during the disc golf throw. Some basic things, you want to stretch out, open up the chest, right? You could, just like I was demonstrating there, you could do a pec stretch. The pec muscles, the fibers run up this direction, so I'm going to go in that plane of motion to increase that. I'm going through its whole range, controlling it back and forth. I might even do a static stretch for your calf. I've met very few people who have really good flexibility in their calves, and with you having to walk throughout the round, having good flexibility is fine there. You can do it statically because we're not really too worried about peak torque production in your calf muscle. Helps out a little bit, but it's not the main thing helping you throw. One simple but obvious example of a dynamic stretch would just be repeating the disc golf throw. I could start in this position with my hips rotated, my arms back, and then follow through. I could just kind of go back and forth through that motion, making sure your foot clears so you're not rotating through your knee, make sure your hips clear. Right? I'm just moving all the muscles I mainly happen to use for the disc golf throw. I could add resistance. I could tie a TheraBand, anchor it over there, and I could just practice engaging these muscles, engaging my core, getting my hips rotating, so I get my glutes firing a little bit more. Those are perfect examples of simple dynamic stretches before you do these activities. You could do something like kick butts, getting the quad muscle to lengthen and shorten. I'm also actively activating my hamstring muscles, so they're going to be warmed up as well. I can work on lat flexibility, holding on to something, allowing my lats to lengthen by bringing my body down, allowing my hips to flex, keeping my knees slightly bent as I do that, back and forth like that. Those are all really simple, basic ideas that you can use to stretch. You really don't need to overthink it or do too much. One thing to keep in mind is you should not be rotating through your lumbar spine. If you're ever going to do rotational things, don't do it like this. You're going to rotate through your lumbar spine. Make sure your hips clear as you're doing these motions. That's going to keep you safe. A common exercise I see is people lay on the ground and let their knees fall from one side to the other. Don't do it that way. Most of the time, if you don't have enough hip flexion, you're going to rotate through your lumbar spine. A better way to do it, I'll put a link to the thoracic video we talked about, is laying on your side, bending up both knees, and allowing your thoracic spine to rotate. With enough hip flexion and pelvic rotation, it really locks out your lumbar spine and forces you to get it where you need to be getting it. So don't do that first stretch laying flat on your back and letting the legs rotate. It's really not an ideal way of doing it. Last couple thoughts I wanted to bring up. Some specifics on the studies, for those who are wanting more detail, is that when you saw the decrease in peak torque production, it was really not a whole lot. Some studies range from about 1% to maybe 3 or 4% change in peak torque production. So, and dynamic stretching makes sense right before competition. But then again, the changes only lasted for maybe about 10 minutes. So if you're going to stretch 10 minutes before the competition, it may not have an actual effect on the way you're performing during that event. On the other hand, too, when they did a static stretch and it had that negative effect, it was only with stretches that were held for 60 seconds or more at one time. So the other thing you could do is you could do a static stretch, but just decrease the duration of the hold that you're doing, and then it's not really so much of an issue. In the end, make sure you're stretching. You can do dynamic stretching before a competition. Makes a lot of sense. You could, though, do static stretching, just hold for shorter durations, or do it long enough before your activity that you don't have those negative side effects. Definitely be working on those static stretches outside of pre-competition. Thanks for joining us on the Disc Golf Doctor. If you have any thoughts, suggestions, ideas, let me know. I'm always open to them. Thanks for joining us, and please subscribe.